All right, everyone. Well, as Amy mentioned earlier, we will be starting off this morning with a keynote address. And for our first keynote address, it is my great honor to introduce Commissioner Mike O'Reilly of the FCC. I'm sure most of the people in this room are very familiar with his long career in public service, but for those who are not, Commissioner O'Reilly is serving his second term on the FCC, being first appointed by President Obama in 2013. Prior to that, he worked for 20 years with the United States House of Representatives in various positions relating to communications policy and leadership, culminating with a position with the Republican House Whip. Now, please join me in welcoming Commissioner Mike O'Reilly.
Well, thank you so, and good morning on this cold day. From someone from Buffalo, this is cold, I got to tell you. And I can't say I miss that snow at all. My car is quite icy. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Amy, for inviting me to join Silicon Flatiron's annual flagship event. This organization always convenes conferences with all-star lineups, with the exclusion of myself, to consider and debate the most important technology and telecommunications issues of the day. There must be something about heading to the beautiful state of Colorado, and I can only guess what it might be, that helps people, participants, and attendees alike to delve deeper, introspect a bit more, challenge competing arguments fuller, and maybe even critique others' work without causing excessive offense. That's certainly a rarity in today's hypercharged, easily slighted society. Amy, you also deserve credit, much credit, for what appears to be an effort to maintain bipartisanship in this organization. When Phil transitioned out, no one was quite sure whether it would continue along the same path that brought it much success. Early indications are that it will, and I'm pleased to see that to be the case. A couple things, housekeeping. I see only one other person with a tie on here, so my fellow commissioner, this is what you get when you invite me. I'm coming with a tie. I'm sorry. No matter where it is, I'm going to be wearing the tie. And I apologize in the sense that I'm going to speak mostly probably about things that you talked about yesterday rather than the solutions. I've got a lot of solutions if anyone wants to hit, but that'd be better had at the bar at a later different time. Also, I must regret for having missed the first day. What must have been quite a thought-provoking discussion based on the agenda and the panelists. The underlying premise behind the discussion topic, that advancements in technology may lead to some negative consequences, is undoubtedly correct. Not to get too metaphysical, but the evolution of man is defined by the harsh effects and unattended realities resulting from beneficial discoveries and inventions, often attributable to questionable and nefarious applications. With the discovery of fire giving rise to arson-generated wildfires, the invention of the wheel resulting in drunk driving deaths, and the development of air flight in enabling the awful events of 9/11, just to name a few examples, it is hard to examine any major advancement and not see man's corrosive effects. So it should not be completely unexpected that there's a healthy skepticism towards technological developments. That is not to suggest that we should halt progress or stymie innovation, but only that we recognize that there will be likely fear about the potential tangible downsides of any technology. The challenge for those of us charged with regulatory authority over certain technologies is to explain, educate, and to some degree manage expectations. Added to that is the obligation to enable the proper environment for innovation and only take regulatory action when absolutely necessary, and only to the extent that doing so produces greater benefits relative to costs. In other words, our concern about any potential downside cannot be an automatic bar to further innovation, lest we expect to return to the days of dwelling in caves without fire. Accordingly, I think the fundamental question of this conference is, should one be an optimist or pessimist with regard to current and future technological advancement, or both? In expressing the need for a nuanced perspective, noted lyricist Bruce Springsteen probably said it best. Pessimism and optimism are slammed up against each other in my records. The tension is where it's all at. Lights the fire. Ah, Springsteen. As for me, I am truly and wholeheartedly optimistic that society will benefit and advance from technology. On the other hand, The pessimist in me knows that there'll be noteworthy downsides, exposing humans to, in some cases, unforeseeable and unimaginable strife and pain. At the same time, I'm confident the government, in trying to predict the future and prevent these circumstances, can screw up any potential successes with improper and heavy-handed regulation. With your indulgence, I'd like to explore some of these pressure points which are most likely to develop. It doesn't take a technologist or futurist to see where technology eventually may take society. Next-generation technology not far on the horizon may provide full or partial solutions to the problems, ranging from the mundane to the monumental, that have plagued mankind for generations. Food supply, potable water, livable housing, weather prediction, transportation safety, sustainable energy, and healthcare are just to name a few of the major areas in which technology will transform the globe, minimize our suffering, lengthen our lifespan, improve our overall enjoyment, and allow mankind to progress forward. Top of this list of prominent technology advances must be the endless possibilities brought forth by artificial intelligence. While we are merely at the infancy of AI, its promise is truly breathtaking. Essentially, it consists of software and computer code, which isn't necessarily all that exciting in and of itself, but when combined with the ability, or the magic, if you will, to essentially learn as time passes, the necessary ingredients are available to address significant problems facing our world. Can AI, perhaps when combined with quantum computing, surpass the brain power of man? That is currently unclear, but we're going to eventually find out. With appropriate capacity, AI has the ability to replace teams of humans working on the most complex projects. Consider having 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 individuals of Albert Einstein's intellect working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year to develop a detection method for some type of cancer before it reaches stage 1, along with determining the appropriate treatment to prevent its harmful effects from materializing. Just imagine the economic, societal, and emotional benefits of halting recalcitrant cancers in their tracks. It is possible that a team of scientists could replicate this effort, but at what cost, in what time frame, and with what degree of mental fatigue? Clearly, the computing capabilities of AI can and likely will produce societal benefits. Its applications are only limited by our imagination, whether we can train coders fast enough, and the speed at which AI systems actually learn the right lessons from the data to obtain accurate results. Nonetheless, humans will need to trust in AI for it to succeed and prove its worth, but I'm optimistic that will happen. Turning topics ever so slightly, it is impossible to examine where technology may go and whether its impact will be positive without considering its past. Take the last 20 years of the internet's existence, which has provided access to an avalanche of information now available to every individual, both the sophisticate and the layman, and related to every facet of life, both the current and historical. Literally at our keyboard touching fingertips exists the greatest human data dump ever known to man. It's like everyone was given their own magnifying glass and time travel machine, along with unlimited funds, and told to go research and explore whatever in the entire world meets their interests and needs. The information available in the next 20 years is likely to far, far surpass even what's online today and will change human behavior accordingly. If this explosion of knowledge was once limited by capacity and transmission speeds, neither will be a problem in a cloud universe with uber-fast wireless 5G networks or next-generation fiber or satellite technologies. Moreover, how we use this vast wealth of information will change. Rather than merely serving as a depository of data and facts, for instance, to look up which film won the '96 Best Picture Oscar or resolve senior moments, not that I have any, of course. In the future, the internet will provide the means to acquire real knowledge. Having the ability to obtain all the data in the world, like holding a key to a library, is an incredible benefit. But enabling people to conquer the material and make it useful is what will be transformative. What if we could program the metaphorical library itself to read and analyze all of its own books, synthesize that data along with all other libraries in the world, and offer new perspectives that we have previously been alluded to? Being able to organize this information and create value for web surfers that we haven't yet conceived will convert every seat with an internet connection into a college classroom. Higher institutions may have to offer courses and lectures for next to nothing. While today distance learning is an option and add-on, future iterations will be far, far more compelling and provide more desired pathway to enlightenment. The hallowed halls of today may become virtual campuses full of stimulated classrooms if they remain at all. Though that means nothing, this institution will go on forever. Technology can allow the elements that make the classroom and campuses so unique to exist anywhere in the world. How's that for a disruptive prognosis? Technology advances are also likely to further expand the ways in which we communicate with each other. Over the last decade or so, we have enjoyed an explosion of communication tools, much of which is internet application-based, that allows individuals to talk, text, video conference, post thoughts and photos, etc., in order to share their experiences with loved ones located across the world or sometimes in the next room. One prominent feature of this development has been the obliteration of old-school pricing models based on cost per minute or antiquated local versus long-distance labels. As a result, while fixed connectivity costs may always exist to some extent, the real marginal cost to communicate has been driven down to practically zero. Those unwilling to accept this fate have seen their subscribers and their corresponding traffic decline as users switch to other options. For example, why would anyone use SMS texting with some associated cost per message component added to their bill, or live with artificial caps when there are more popular, more trendy, more advanced options available for free? In an SMS versus in a WhatsApp fight, SMS doesn't stand a chance. I am optimistic that this trend will continue and accelerate to include more and newer technologies. Once limited to Star Wars or Star Trek franchises, holograms and 3D video communications are not far away. Moreover, I have heard serious thinkers outline the case for why esports will dominate all earthly activity, not just entertainment. This perspective may require a bit of unpacking. The concept, which boasts huge investment following, is that there are likely to be computer-generated augmented reality rooms or centers to serve as a substitute for many human experiences today. Thus, instead of traveling to a foreign country or joining a business meeting in person, everyone will be able to go through a virtual portal located wherever the person happens to be at the moment. The disruptive effects could be staggering to large traditional economic sectors. Well, this may seem far-fetched, I admit it. Such technologies do exist today and certainly have the ability to devour existing communication platforms. Yet what occupies the time of so many at the Commission? Access charges, cost accounting for circuit-switched copper networks, media ownership. Issues like these are going to rightly evaporate, and I fully expect the role of the Commission to diminish exponentially. We have little role, if any, to play in many of these newer platforms, and there appears to be little interest in giving the Commission any new authority to regulate in this space. Almost 100 years of regulatory work should eventually disappear like a puff of smoke on a windy day. Without something to fill in the void, the Commission will and should shrink considerably. On the other side of the coin, there is good reason to be pessimistic regarding certain areas of technological progress. First and foremost, we should all acknowledge that the brilliant minds behind innovative products and services are often obtuse when it comes to societal policy and consumer protection implications of certain practices and functionalities, and thus are prone to some shockingly blind spots. I tend to refer to this phenomenon as tech naivete. Let me provide you with an example. Many years ago, I visited Silicon Valley and spoke to a technology company that was preparing a new drone product. the senior management of the company was completely caught off guard by the mere suggestion that their new offering may create a privacy concern for many individuals, and that the government might react poorly to every Jimmy and Janie flying their own drones throughout America, towns and countryside, taking photos and videos of their neighbors. How is it possible they didn't see potential red flags that I saw almost immediately? Perhaps by focusing so much energy and effort on producing a great technological advancement, the company hadn't taken the time to consider other factors, the societal and regulatory context, as it were. This phenomenon is surprisingly not that all out of the ordinary. When I was last here at Silicon Flatirons, I raised the fact that disability advocates had urged the technology developers to consider the disabled communities' needs from the very start of a new project. Well, a laudable goal, I explained that I found that to be somewhat unrealistic. The process of thinking of and building a better widget or software program is typically focused on the functions of the technology and code itself, without necessarily stopping to consider all of its potential uses and applications and the attendant impact it may have on particular groups, such as those in the disabled community. Instead, that usually comes far after considerations such as proof of concept, design, and markability. That is not to say that such policy implications should be ignored, only that such considerations are not aforethought with creativity going on. Well, I do not see changes coming organically to the ingenuity process. There should be every expectation that those who market, sell, distribute the next whiz-bang thingamajig will conduct such analysis. Failing to do so may be merely inconsiderate from a societal perspective, but from a business perspective, it's naive and downright foolhardy. The ability to forecast such consequences is why so many of my friends and enemies, and some in this audience, are actually employable in Washington. Technology advocates have the responsibility to listen to these incredibly smart people who are brilliant in their own right at seeing potential blind spots. Secondly, never underestimate the ability of government entities to screw up the great American success story that is the technology industry. There is a natural tendency for every government department and agency with a tangential relationship to tech issues to want to grow its authority or power base. This is not a matter for those with proper authority seeking to perform their jobs, but rather reflects a penchant for empire building and remains relevant in a changing world. The desire of some to want to be involved in every shiny new toy often supersedes the real authority. Nowhere is this more true than the debates brewing in the tech space. Few government employees are willing to admit that an issue before them is someone else's responsibility. Not only does this mean that companies oftentimes have to file and appear before multiple agencies, but also, not surprisingly, it is why for every current tech probe, there are 4 or 5 to follow. And these all come with costs in terms of time, money, and economic productivity. Every such effort means company staff needs to talk and strategize internally, consider hiring outside counsel, submit tons of paper, potentially prepare company leaders for multiple rounds of hearings, and so much more, thereby redirecting resources from innovators. Consider AI. I just read about a federal department with no real oversight or authority over AI, appointing a new person to oversee AI within its ranks. It is likely that AI may have an impact on a heavily regulated, highly important industry, no? Absolutely. But in the absence of direct regulatory authority, a rather outlier role such as this will be traditionally and appropriately be added to the portfolio of some individual already within the existing multi-layered bureaucracy, not established as a new, specialized, highly sensationalized slot. Along these lines, I am also pessimistic that the usual suspects will refrain from trying to ensconce many technology offerings within this existing but dying vestiges of the Commission's own authority. We've seen this in the past with the profoundly flawed efforts to adopt net neutrality regulations and the effort to apply Title II to broadband offerings. Moreover, we have heard calls to subject online video platforms to same rules that are suffocating traditional broadcasters and cable programmers. In fact, there will be, unfortunately, there never will be a shortage of socialist soothsayers and sages claiming that dusty legacy rules must be applied to business offerings of certain technology companies. Memories are surprisingly short in our universe, and many lessons repeatedly go unlearned. Failures to provide legislative guidance on certain matters will result in regulators' sensationalist attempt to capture technology companies in the Byzantine regulatory environment once reserved for communication providers. Maybe I should have started with the bad news and ended on a high note. In any case, hopefully that provides a picture of some of the tensions between optimism and pessimism, at least as I see it, that policymakers struggle to deal with on a daily basis, and to which Springsteen such alluded. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have or get on with the real speakers and provide some more enlightenment to you all. Thank you very much. I saw a lot of people sleeping out there. That's okay. I've been up for 6 hours, so that's a much different scenario. We're not seeing any questions. I'm happy to answer it. Oh, there's one. Okay.
Born to Run. So, Born to Run, great Bruce Springsteen song or greatest Bruce Springsteen song?
Well, look, there's a lot to be said for the boss. He had some good quotes that I'm happy to use. I like when he sings and doesn't profess about politics. How about that?
All right, maybe a real question. I'm from DARPA, and we just recently had the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge. I know Jessica Wars and Sorcel is out there. I don't remember if you made it to the competition for the final. It was a great start, right? It was the spark of using machine learning and AI for spectrum allocation and sharing spectrum. But like the DARPA Grand Challenge back in the early 2000s, we're just now seeing autonomous vehicles really come to be on the roads. I was just in my first one in Vegas. It was quite fun. So really, given that the time lag between when we kind of have these types of events versus what you were talking about the obsolescence of regulatory agencies like yours, or at least the shrinking of them, what is the perspective of who takes that next step? DARPA does its thing. We usually have a short attention span, so we're kind of walking away. We're like, we did it. We're done. Who's going to be able to take that next step, and what is the commission's perspective on how you're going to help take what we started there and keep it going forward?
I don't think I've been shy in my job, my 6.5 years at the commission, in talking about these issues and being aggressive and trying to prepare the agency for the next step. Sometimes that makes me friendly and foes and all like, been talking about the scope of what the commission's expected to do in the future. Many of the things you talked about are going to be deep challenges going forward, and they do shake the current models that we have. Are they perfected at the current moment? Are they something that we should fully endorse? And I would say no. I'm hesitant to do some of that. So there much more work has to go into some of those things, some of those models, that structure that we're talking about. I can see promise in certain instances where it makes complete sense. In others, I say it's a foolhardy challenge. So trying to find that perfect position. The difficulty in my job is, and the agency itself, is we're constantly worried about the immediate. We're trying to get 6 to 8 items on a meeting every month and trying to stay focused on exactly what we can do. The long-term planning, the harder work that you do, how do you plan 5 years out? That is something that we don't exactly haven't perfected. This Chairman Pai has been great at doing some of that. It's just not an easy task with all the things before us. And the relationship that we have and the chairman has built, and some of it's not that I can do, and Commissioner Rosenworcel was out to see, there's only so much we can do at the commission level. Some of that takes from the chairman himself, and he's been engaged in all those issues. So I appreciate all of that. There's going to be a lot of conversations, a lot of work. Some of that's going to have to come from the big institution, big white institution with a lot of legislatures and legislators in it to give us guidance on what they'd like to see us do. And what it does help that there is funding in certain places such as yours that we don't exactly always benefit from. So there's lots of good collaboration to be had. I see a question over here. Are we running out of time? Or? We have one over here. Okay. Oh.
Mike Baransoka, Tech Freedom. What have you learned in your experience as a regulator about the trade-offs between generally applicable laws and laws that are crafted for a particular industry that create the kind of fights that you've experienced over jurisdictional lines? And in particular, what have you learned about the dangers of regulatory capture?
Look, people used to criticize the Commission for Regulatory Capture by this industry or that industry. A lot of those industry or those players have moved on. And I'd say we have a very diverse group of folks that come before us today. I look at some other agencies and I'm just amazed how the people can critique our regulatory capture. It boggles my mind to see how much an advocate they can be for their particular regulatory agency, where we are fighting those on a daily basis. But to your first point, look at statutes are being, the most tailored statutes are being misread and abused for particular reasons, and the more generally applicable statutes are used for whatever reasons people would like them to be. I've given this speech 10, 15 times. I've talked to Capitol Hill. I said, if you would like something done, tell us what it is. If you don't want something done, that's more important. Tell us what you don't want done. Make it very clear. Think out what the worst things the Commission could do and prevent them in statute. And some of that has occurred and some of it hasn't. And I can only provide my advice to that. We at the agency use the statute for our benefit. There have been a couple examples that I could cite where I would argue, having lived through some of that wasn't exactly what the statute was intended for. I can't say it's prohibited by the law. It would be helpful if Congress were to clear that up in some instances. In others, we'll just have to play it out and see if the courts agree. I don't know if that helps. Final question. Sir, what's your question?
Andy Schwartzman from the Benton Institute. This is only slightly off topic. There has been a premise of this conference and what you've been talking about is that governments, federal and state governments, need to have a lot of technological capacity and understanding in order to be able to plan and implement policy. There has been an exodus of experienced career people in the executive branch, and the FCC, through retirement, has lost its most important technologist, Julie Knapp, who deserved to retire, don't get me wrong. How do you see, in an era of what may be shrinking government in this part of the government and the various challenges that the government faces in trying to provide competitive salaries and offerings, how do you see the government as being able to stay up technologically in order to make good policy?
Well, look, I'll throw in another data point for you, and I've said this publicly. I think our move is going to make a number of people at the Commission leave. We're moving in 6 months. We're going to find we have a new home that's being built, and I think the number of people are going to find the commute absolutely stink. And they're probably going to not decide to work there anymore. And I've been predicting somewhere of a quarter of the people. And it won't be the terrible people, it'll be the people you really need. All right? That's usually what happens, right? The people who can find jobs elsewhere do. There are good people throughout government. And I work with them today, and I've worked with them for 25 years now. And people who I'd like to consider myself some of that, willing to set aside or even just to, enjoy the work, and recognize the benefits it brings to society, and set aside whatever fortunes that could be made, and houses and second houses and cars and whatever. I've been doing this in the government. People say, oh, you've never worked in the private sector, and that's true. I've never enjoyed the check of a private sector, and many of my colleagues at the Commission and fellow staffers haven't, and I appreciate the work that they've done. I will say, I disagree with, and this is slightly off topic to your question, but I know it comes up from time to time, and I was thinking about a blog about this. I disagree with this idea that we need to create a new agency or office to provide advice to legislators and Capitol Hill. I was there when we eliminated the old one, and I'm not excited at all about the possibility of creating a new one. I was there writing statutes, working behind the scenes on early things when I was much younger, with no gray hair. And we didn't rely on the old agency. In fact, it was dismissed by both Republicans and Democrats at the time. And so creating another one for that purpose, the belief that members of Congress can't master this industry to the certain extent that they need, I think is preposterous, because you think of all the other industry sectors that come before them, and I worked on some of these things, to think that our same members, the same members that we elect, are dealing with nuclear reactors and warheads on a daily basis, but don't have a specialized congressional office to provide experience or thoughts on some of those matters, but we need one for here, I think is preposterous. So I'm not a big fan. That's something for them to decide and not me, but if asked, I dismiss it. I think we will have plenty of people. There are plenty of people who enter every day, who set aside their careers, set aside their life to fulfill the needs of their fellow citizens, and I'm honored to be part of that. Well, with that, I'm going to let you get to the future of your panel. Thank you so very much.
All right, everyone, we're going to jump right into our next panel, Building the Future We Want. So I am just going to mention that as these panelists are talking about solutions, as Amy mentioned, since they have such a heavy lift, this is going to be a two-part panel. So they will be speaking for an hour now, and then we'll take a short break, and then the same panelists will come back with a different moderator to wrap up their conversation. So with that, here we go. All right, so with that, I will pass it over to Professor Harry Surden, one of our professors here at Silicon Flatirons, to start us off on this panel.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Connor. And as Connor said, I'm Harry Surden. I'm a professor here at the law school, and I'm also director of the Silicon Flatirons Artificial Intelligence Initiative. So got a lot of interesting programming around that. I want to thank Amy and the amazing Silicon Flatiron staff for putting on a terrific conference so far, and the celebration last night was amazing, so I'm really grateful for that. So today on this panel, we're going to talk about solutions, building the solutions to all of the issues that we talked about. However, this discussion will be divided into two parts. This part, we will focus in on some of the major problems that we want to solve, distilling and articulating and synthesizing some of the ideas that we've heard. And the second part of the discussion, which will be led by Professor Cristelia Garcia immediately following this, will be focused on turning some of those problems into solutions and building the world that we want. I have an amazing panel of terrifically talented people here with me today that I'm so grateful that they're here. I'm just going to introduce them briefly by name and title, but I invite you to click the links on the website to read about their very impressive histories. Just in alphabetical order, to my left, we have Liesl Brunner, who is the Director of Global Policy at AT&T. Next, we have Gabriella Colima, who is the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University. Next, we have Chris Lewis, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Public Knowledge. Next, we have Baron Soka, President and Founder of Tech Freedom. And last but not least, John Verdi, who is Vice President of Policy of the Future of Privacy Forum. So this is an amazing panel. They traveled far and wide to be here. I'm really grateful for that. Let's start off, even though this is the panel about problems, let's start off optimistically, because I'm the inveterate optimist. And we talk to Liesl first and ask her, where is technology working well today in terms of its impact on society?
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here at this great conference. I think that technology has many ordinary impacts on our lives that portend for the great potential things that it could do down the line. When you think about things like when I started my career, telecommuting was very uncommon. Kind of conference calling, conference software was not particularly common. And so if your children were sick, you had to take a sick day and miss work. And today, you can telecommute 1 or 2 days a week, or however many days a week you like. You can work in a completely different place from where your organization is based. If your children get sick, you can work from home, you can do your conference calls, and you don't have to miss those days. You can get an app on your phone that tells you when the bus is coming, or if there is a delay on public transportation. And those little little things that make our lives a little bit more convenient, that give us our time back, make a big difference. One of the stories that we have at AT&T is our technician optimization tool that we've developed. So we have a workforce of tens of thousands of workers who go to different places in the network, including customers' homes, to install Wi-Fi, internet access, television, to repair services, and dispatching all of these technicians, figuring out the order in which they go, the equipment that they have to take with them, who's right for what job, is an incredibly data-intensive operation. And so we've used artificial intelligence and machine learning to put all this data into an application, to analyze it and crunch it out, and figure out how to send our technicians to the places that are right for them, to identify which jobs maybe don't need a technician, don't need an expert in this area, can be handled over the phone, in a way that has reduced kind of unnecessary trips, reduced the situations in which they show up and they don't have the necessary equipment and they have to go back another time. It has reduced the window that we give customers who are waiting at home for someone to come and fix something, which previously was 4 hours. So you're stuck at home from 8 to 12 saying, okay, do I take my kids to school now? Do I have time to run an errand? When is this person coming? We were able to reduce that window. Customers are sometimes able to track their technician and figure out where they are so that you say, okay, I do have time to go run that errand. It has increased the job satisfaction of our technicians, who have been an integral part in designing the tool. All of this has taken place within the bounds of the collective bargaining agreement that we have with our employees. And the technicians have helped us design the tool, have provided constant feedback as to how it's working, and so they're part owners of it. And they feel that their time is better used. Because it's a use of employee data, our Employee Data Governance Board had to approve it prior to implementation, put some conditions on the uses of the employees' data. And we've also discovered that it has resulted in approximately 61 million less pounds of carbon into the atmosphere because it's reduced unnecessary trips. It's made the trips more efficient. We've calculated things like weather, the technician's skills, and kind of average job completion time to make everything so much more efficient that it's kind of led to a net win for everyone. And so if we can take technology and put it to those kind of uses that give us more meaningful professional experiences, more of our time back, and have a positive impact on the environment, then I think that's where technology is really going to continue to benefit us. And the next great challenge is the environment, putting technology to use to come up with some really great solutions to our problems of climate change.
Great, so that's a really good example where I think technology is incrementally making life better, but it's easy to overlook those incremental improvements. Let me throw this out to the rest of the panel. Our optimistic question: where is technology working well today?
I'm going to echo some things that were said yesterday. Yeah. But I think that there's various communities, let's just say people with disabilities or illness communities, who have been able to come together online, share information, fight stigma, learn about treatment options. I mean, this has been really revolutionary in the history of kind of medicine, health, and illness. And I would say that this is something that continues to be incredibly important for advocacy, empowerment, and managing kind of illness and treatment. So I would say this is absolutely one area that has been profoundly important.
Yeah,
Beneficial.
That's a really good point. And I think related to that, one thing that goes overlooked is technology is being used to expose abuses. They used to exist in silence and gives a platform for people to say, hey, this type of abuse is going on, pay attention to it. And we never have seen that in history before. Chris, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways. I really appreciate Liesel's efficiencies argument. If I were to pick one that I think is most important is just the value of free expression that technology has provided. And I think we heard it in the debate yesterday. Cindy Cohn was saying that the problem is us when it comes to technology, and I think that's true. However, there's a balance that we're going to have to strike, and the balance between free expression and safe communities or safety and privacy is just huge. But I don't think we can underestimate how over the last 2 decades, voices who could not be heard before, voices who could not afford to communicate, have proliferated online, and their ability to participate in society has just dramatically increased. And so to respect that, to value it, and to preserve it with all the other challenges, I think is paramount.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think this idea of underrepresented voices now having an ability to participate. Related to that also is the proliferation of user-generated content, which we've never seen such a flourishing in history of all these talented people who would otherwise have languished in obscurity. Baron, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'll echo Chris's point, but put it in slightly different terms. I think this is about a radical reshaping of power in society. And yes, it's true that really marginalized people have been able to speak out in ways that were never imaginable before. I mean, transgender experience is not new, but for the first time, people are able to speak out about that and interact about that from the earliest stages of their lives on. But I'll put it a little differently in a second sense. We talk a lot about free expression, but to me, what this is really about is free association. I mean, this is Tocqueville's wildest dream, that we are able to, as Americans who thrive in building civic society and intermediating institutions, we are able to do that in a way that was never before imaginable. Tocqueville was impressed because the United States had not just individuals and the government, it had social clubs and churches and all sorts of fraternal organizations. And today, the internet, what we commonly refer to as user-generated content, has really enabled us to build all kinds of intermediating experiences. And that might be a neighborhood group, it might be a group that's focused on a particular cause that never got attention before. But it has reshaped the lives of every single person, from the most privileged to the least privileged in society. So we could go over any number of examples, but I want to suggest that what's really important is that we take for granted the positive things that technology has given us. And that's really for 2 reasons. There are 2 fundamental cognitive biases that distort this conversation. The first is status quo bias. We take for granted the things that are around us. Arthur C. Clarke, of course, said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And what he was talking about is a kind of particular status quo bias where, something happens that yesterday would have been absolutely thrilling, and today just becomes, just another magical thing that allows us to travel from one continent to the next in the blink of an eye. So we think a lot about that. I think we think less about negativity bias. Negativity bias makes us focus on bad things to the exclusion of overwhelmingly positive things. This is a really fundamental fact about human psychology that I think we need to really keep in mind, that we will inevitably dwell on the downsides of any development at the expense of recognizing the positive things. So instead of giving you particular examples of technologies that I'd like to celebrate, I'd like to suggest 3 things that might help us all reclaim our sense of wonder and help us get over those 2 biases. One of them is going to technology museums. They're all over the world. They're called all kinds of things. They're arts and industries, or they're industrial design. Sometimes they're actually about technology. I have found, sort of doing this over the last few years, and I found it to be really helpful to be able to think about the technologies that we experience today without those two biases, to see the things that people were excited about, the things that people experimented with, to see that early teletype, the early prototypes of teletype machines had actual keyboards, like piano keyboards, right? And to understand that we take for granted that this is what a computer is today, but there are so many paths that got us to that point that have delivered these technologies that have changed our lives. You only appreciate them if you get to see all of the things that were not done. The second is old science fiction. So reading someone like Jules Verne is absolutely thrilling because you get to see the small things that people were really excited about back then, and it helps you remember today that these things that you take for granted actually are dramatic and transformative and in most cases overwhelmingly positive. And then the final thing is the international expos, the world's fairs, right? Those were the internet before the internet, or they were Wikipedia before Wikipedia. Those were the places that you went to be excited about the future. And they're absolutely electrifying. If you find catalogs of those old fairs, you can go back and understand a moment in time when people could see a new series of technologies on the horizons and be excited about them. And of course, in many ways, they were irrationally exuberant, but a lot of the things that they deployed have shaped our modern world. And I really encourage everyone who works in technology policy to try those three things, to find other ways to reset their gauge for what technology means in their lives. And I think it will help us all accentuate the positive, even as we have our conversation about how to deal with negatives.
Okay, that's great, Baron. I really love those comments and those ideas. I just want to emphasize this idea, right, without dismissing or devaluing the problems of today, which are real, we also don't want to go so far the other way and give in to our cognitive negativity bias and forget to appreciate all the great things, even something as simple as indoor plumbing or antibiotics or air conditioning, let alone the internet that have, changed our lives. And I think a technology museum is really a helpful way of thinking about that. John?
Sure. So I will second what Baron said. I will add, for those of you who have children in your lives, whether they're your children or children of friends or colleagues or others, thinking about the ways in which they engage with technology versus the ways in which we engaged with technology when we were that age can put quite a fine point on highlighting the amazing tools that they have at their disposal today versus what we had many, many years ago. And that is not to discount the problems, but to juxtapose those two situations is, I think, to see in stark relief a lot of the significant benefits of contemporary technology in the year 2020. I would suggest a couple of things. First is that while acknowledging the challenges that we have that arise from some technologies, I think it is broadly true that we are healthier, safer, and more creative today than we have ever been as a society here in the United States and around the world. That is largely down to these wonderful tools that exist. And there was a lot of discussion yesterday about things like CRISPR, things like drone delivery of blood therapy, things like safety mechanisms that help keep drivers and pedestrians and cyclists dying at lower rates than they otherwise would. And there was also talk about some of the challenges when it comes to communications technologies and social media. I think it behooves us to think about these tools, and some of these tools are connected tools that help connect us, but many of them are not. Many of them are simply tools that help us catch and cure diseases more quickly and efficiently, that keep us safer and provide us with the opportunity to freely speak and associate and express ourselves. I also think it's notable that companies and individuals are taking steps to mitigate some of the challenges of these technologies. If you said to me 5 years ago or 6 years ago that mobile cell phone makers and tablet makers would be implementing features that decreased engagement and helped users track screen time, that helped users get better sleep at night, right? I would have been quite surprised because those handset makers thrive on engagement, on promoting engagement with those devices. But at the same time, we sit here in 2020 and the leading handset manufacturers, the leading software developers are taking into account proactively how to best mitigate some of the downsides of individuals' engagement with technology. And the final thing I would note is that companies are increasingly implementing safeguards, whether they are safety safeguards, privacy safeguards, et cetera, that exceed existing law. You see this when Apple implements safeguards regarding sensitive health data collected by the Apple Watch when it endeavors to identify cardiac events. The measures, technical, legal, and otherwise, that have been taken in that circumstance exceed the requirements of government here in the United States, and they exceed the requirements of laws elsewhere in the world. The companies have done that in order to promote trust in the services. That isn't to discount the problems, which I think we will get to, but I would encourage folks to think about the wonderful tools, to think about the steps that folks are taking to mitigate some of the downsides of these tools, and to approach this with a recognition that when it comes to health and safety and creativity and expression, we are probably better situated today than we have been for a long time.
Okay, thank you, John. Those are really good points. I think you're right that by most measures, society is healthier, safer. I believe there are fewer people in poverty as a percentage than there's ever been in the history of the world, due largely to technology and economic progress. So I think there's a lot of things to be grateful for, but there are significant challenges. So we're going to shift our focus now to some of the challenges because we want to make the world even better, and we don't want to neglect or devalue those challenges. So Gabriella, I'm going to turn this to you. What are the biggest problems in your view with technology today?
Right. So this was actually a great setup because I'm going to be super naysayer right now. You know, I do love my transit app. When it's -30 in Montreal, it feels like life and death in terms of when you decide to go out for the bus. And I love my plumbing and my heating and tech museums. But, you know, while a little bit later I want to talk more about facial recognition surveillance, data surveillance, because I really do think of this as a pressing problem, I actually wanted to go a bit meta, in part because of what we discussed yesterday and what was just put on the table in terms of a cognitive bias against technology, because I actually think really one of the problems is that we are culturally stacked to overly valorize and embrace technology. And this is actually what I think is one of the biggest problems. So another way of answering the question is the problem with technology is believing that technology will solve our problems. It's what philosopher of technology Albert Borgman has called the promise of technology. And it's really a perduring and enduring cultural commitment far preceding what certain critics of Silicon Valley, for example, have called tech solutionism, right? And again, I have no issues with both technologies that exist. They're very important and very powerful. And also, technologies are often good solutions for technological problems. But I also think that when it comes to the ways in which, let's just say, education organizes itself, science and technology are seen as the most progressive, important educational inputs, with everything that is housed under the arts, whether that's humanities or social science, as kind of second-class citizens. And it doesn't have the same sort of social infrastructure of support as science and technology. And given that some of the interventions that can come from the humanities, the arts, policy, and law are also so important, I think it's really key to kind of equalize the playing field. So part of the problem is, how do you equalize the playing field? Well, one issue is that, and I find this with a lot of my students in the sciences and engineering and technology, who I am fortunate enough to teach, they really can only see technology as an unalloyed good. It is always, in every instance, a wonderful thing. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think coming to technology with an ability to differentiate between, like, okay, this is how we want to move forward with technology, this is how we don't want to move forward with technology, and this is a non-technological solution to a problem, that's the framework I would like to get people to sort of think about. So one of the things I often have to do is kind of get them to approach science and technology in a slightly different way. One of the ways I do this is by exposing them to the history of eugenics, for example. Eugenics was the kind of science, it was the kind of commitment to perfecting the human based on a vision of science and technology, to the extent that it led to the sterilization of human beings and actually the extermination of human beings once it was put under a kind of Nazi regime. And this, I think, like jolts people up to sort of see, okay, science and technology, both in terms of the vision, the progress, and the promise, can go quite wrong, right? And sets them up to sort of think about science and technology in different ways. As important, and I'm starting to wrap up, I think it's also really important to showcase all sorts of interventions that are not rooted in science and technology that have been particularly powerful. So I work on computer hackers and public interest technologists, right? And so one of the domains I work on is open source software, which is a really core component of the plumbing of the internet. Now, why does it succeed? It succeeds because of technology, but it succeeds because of the licensing regimes as well. Those were just as important as the technology itself. If you don't have the license, and if you don't have the social organization of the projects, you also don't have open source. Why are these in any way secondary, for example, to the technology itself? I'll give maybe one more example from the medical field. So obviously there have been amazing advances in cancer. In the past, in the present, there was a bit of discussion around AI and the hopes that that can be used to have better diagnosis. Something that a lot of students don't know is that in the 1970s and prior, if you were diagnosed with cancer, you would often not be told you had cancer because it was such a shameful disease. And Susan Sontag wrote an amazing book, Illness as Metaphor, where she talked about how we need to get rid of the shameful metaphors around cancer. And it proved to be a very powerful intervention in terms of how people experience cancer. So you could throw all the technologies you want, but in the context of kind of cultural ideas of shame and illness, technological solutions are not going to get very far. So just to wrap up, I just think that science and technology is idolized. All the structures in educational systems are stacked towards pushing students to engage in science and technology, to innovate, to support that practice. That is wonderful. I don't want to take that away, but we also need to equalize the terrain so that we have similar forms of social infrastructures of support for non-technological solutions, and we should drape and clothe the ideas of innovation, social progress around non-technological solutions as we do with technology as well.
Thank you. I love that point. I think this idea of, our narrative that we should always go to technology as a solution, can be problematic, and always seeing technology as unalloyed good. And I especially like this idea of, to the extent that technology comes at the expense of the humanities. The humanities is about the human experience, and that's one thing that has been consistent for the last 10,000 years, that we're all humans going through the human experience. So to the extent that gets de-emphasized, I think that is really important to be concerned about. So let me throw that idea about other people's take. Chris, did you have something to say about the biggest problems in your view?
Well, so I just wanted to build off where you were going. I mean, technology is used by humans, or as my pastor likes to say at church, sometimes people just act like people. Mm-hmm. And to me, that gets at some of the biggest challenges in front of us. We have these wonderful tools, and they allow for so many different new things that we have to be conscious of the things that we as people bring to them and can mess up in how they're used. And so, two things come to mind. One is, my bias is definitely towards like U.S. domestic policy, which is what I primarily work in, and so I think of, the diversity of our nation and the digital divides that we face with new technologies. I mean, we've been talking about the digital divide and broadband deployment for years, and I think we have new divides that we're going to have to watch and be wary of with other technologies, even though we haven't solved the broadband deployment digital divide. So think of things like inclusion or exclusion in data and data sets. There's a double-edged sword there of folks being excluded because of how data is collected, because of their access to technology, as well as making sure that the data is used in a proper way and not reinforcing biases in society. There's digital divides around knowledge that we need to be wary of, where markets are changing and access to knowledge is changing as content is being digitized. And we're losing access to secondhand books. We're losing access to libraries of textbooks and information without a high cost to it, and we need to try to stand up for institutions that have traditionally leveled the playing field for access to knowledge, access to education, like our public libraries, and how do we do that in a digital age? These are divides that we need to worry about as technology is advanced. And lastly, I would add, the diversity of our nation leads to divisiveness, and the debate around content moderation is frightening because it's seen as zero sum. And someone's got to make decisions about content. Someone's got to make decisions about what is allowed and what's not allowed, and it can't be made based on I win, you lose, or you lose, and therefore I win because you lose, sort of divisiveness that we have in our society. And I think, in the United States, we have an obligation to solve this because of our unique population, that we're going to face this challenge more than anyone else in the world. And so, these are problems that I think about. We see it in the disinformation problems that are rising online right now. It is going to threaten our institutions that hold society up, starting with our elections. So these are problems I think are biggest in front of us. It's how we as people use the technology.
Thank you, Chris. So I heard big problems, digital divides, access to knowledge that can level the playing field, zero-sum thinking, misuses of media for disinformation. Any other thoughts about, Baron?
Yeah, so I'm pretty optimistic about technology, as you've heard, but as Anne said yesterday, I'm also pretty pessimistic about people, and I'm ambivalent about the interplay between the two, and I think it really depends. So let's start with the positive. I love the Susan Sontag example that Gabriella gave us, because to me, I see that happening everywhere. I actually think that technology has done the sort of thing that Susan Sontag was able to do with her writing through the specific technological media of the time on a scale that was unimaginable. I mean, the reason that it's no big deal to be gay or trans or to have any of these very a-traditional experiences anymore is precisely because our media environment has radically changed and has enabled people to speak out. And I can come to a conference like this and mention that I'm gay, and it's not a big deal. Nobody cares, right? And that is specifically because of technological change. But it's not just that. It's that on Twitter, a friend of mine who has a very senior position in the House of Representatives can mention that he was raped and talk openly about that experience, precisely because having that conversation is essential to destigmatizing it. Same thing for mental illness, right? I mean, I could go on with many, many examples, right? This is the kind of reorientation of power that Chris was talking about at the beginning that technology has enabled. And that's enabled us to overcome some of the most painful, harmful stigmas in our society. So that sort of thing makes me very optimistic about the interplay between technology and people. But there are good reasons to be pessimistic as well, of course. And to me, I think about those in 3 dimensions. And I think we are in a real crisis, particularly in this country, in each of these. The first and most fundamental is epistemic, right? The problem in America today is not fundamentally politics, it's not Donald Trump. It is about how we know what truth is and whether we believe that it's possible for there to be truth, what kind of verification we accept, and so on. That is the fundamental crisis we're in, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure. But I think our complaints about information technology, or the reason that we are most focused on information technology, are fundamentally because of that set of questions. That set of questions ties into a very related layer, which is the cultural layer. Chris is quite right that the really significant thing to emphasize about the United States is that we are simultaneously the world leader in the technologies that we're discussing, information technologies, and in their adoption, and also a uniquely diverse country with a unique racial and ethnic history. And it is the intersection between those 2 things that I think make our culture wars particularly an inescapable part of our technology policy debates. Right? Fundamentally, the debate about content moderation, for instance, is really about culture and about people feeling that they are being victimized, even when one might think that they're incredibly privileged and defending orthodox positions that are simply being eroded by the positive changes in technology. And then finally, it's a little outside the field here for our conversation, but I do think it's important to keep in mind. The other thing that is really significant about the United States is I think our constitutional system, our system of government, is uniquely vulnerable to this epistemic and cultural crisis. We have, as we all know, a first-past-the-post system for election. We have essentially an elected monarchy every 4 years. Our entire politics fixates around that, and that combination of things, as opposed to a parliamentary system with coalition governments or ranked choice voting or whatever system you want to describe, I think makes our politics particularly vulnerable to toxification from those first 2 dimensions. And so those are the things that I worry about, and one can be very optimistic about technology in general, and really genuinely concerned about those things. And I think it's important for us to be realistic about that and have that conversation about what's going wrong before we immediately jump to knee-jerk solutions.
Great. I love that. What I heard was one of the biggest technological problems, which I also heard echoed in Chris's comments, were truth and understanding the reality and the problem of disinformation. And then I heard, which also echoes some of Gabriella's comments, is that technology is merely a tool, and it's also mirroring some of the larger issues of society that are also important, but also get dismissed if we overfocus on technology and fail to look at the other aspects of our culture and humanity, which I think is a really important point. Liesl, did you want to make a comment?
Sure, and I'm sure John wants to jump in later too. Responding to Barron's example of people coming out online and looking for information, forming communities, I think that is a fabulous example of some of the benefits of online technology. But I also appreciated Britton Heller's stories yesterday about online harassment and the impact that has on the level of discourse on the internet, on people's ability to express themselves freely. And this is not, criticizing people for political opinions or divisive, debates. This is, activity that is intended to terrify and sometimes has offline, real-world consequences, such as the swatting and physical harassment that she told us about. And that, that is something that we are getting a little bit better about in the United States. I think we're starting to recognize that as a problem and think about solutions. Unfortunately, I think in some countries, in India and Pakistan, if you're a woman online with an opinion, it's not a good place to be, and there are a lot of voices that are lost that way. I also think a lot about the Chinese social credit system, which is something that might have come out of one of Carl Schroeder's novels, and the idea that people can be put on a blacklist or a whitelist, and many of these factors, including your kind of online and offline activity, can determine things like what school you get into, what restaurant or hotel you get into, whether you're allowed to get on a train or an airplane. And the fact that China is very eagerly exporting that model around the world, and pretty soon there will be many countries in which that is your life is determined by all of these factors analyzing your behavior, is something that we all need to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, I love that example of the credit system, because that's at least from our cultural perspective is a very dystopian idea, and it's happening right now. It's not in the future. It's happening there. People literally cannot get on trains or planes if their social credit score is too low.
Just a quick example. I just want to mention, I went to UVA Law School, and we had on the faculty a series of professors who had clerked for Justice Powell. And he had had one gay clerk every year for like 20 years without realizing it. And when Bowers v. Hardwick was decided in 1986, as you all may know, he was the swing vote, and he ultimately cast his vote with the conservative majority, and they upheld the Georgia law that criminalized sodomy. And later he said he regretted his vote. He didn't really think very much about it at the time. But the story that really stuck with me, that our dean told, was that his clerk at the time really pleaded with him, tried to make the case to him about what this would mean for real people, but he didn't have the courage to actually come out to Justice Powell. And Justice Powell said something to him like, well, I just don't understand why anyone would do this. He had no sense of reality to him. He couldn't relate. And all the clerk could say to him was, well, Justice Powell, you do know gay people, you just don't know that they're gay. That's what's changed, right? This is the negativity bias that I'm talking about, right? That is a complete transformation in our society, that we are now open about things like that. That is enormously beneficial. And of course, there's still online harassment, but the experience of people like that has been radically changed because technology has made it possible for us to be open, and for someone like Justice Powell to just not be able to escape the reality of people who are different from him in his life.
That's a great point. Before I get to John, because I know I just want to give Gabriella 15 seconds to respond.
I mean, it is, I don't like regulating people getting together online for the reasons you talk about, but people on the right are also getting together in order to form the politics to demonize social justice warriors to a degree that many young people who would have maybe gone progressive start to be very critical of things that we have fought so hard to get. And it's not the technology that's going to tip the balance. We have to think about how we organize and how we pitch our rhetoric to counter that hate. And sure, technology is a great tool in that, but if we just put the technology on the pedestal, it downplays the fact that we have very hard organizational and rhetorical work ahead of us now to counter the pendulum, which is swinging.
Great point. John?
I want to highlight two circumstances in which technology does, I think, tip the balance, and one big picture. The two circumstances where I think technology does tip the balance, we are seeing some folks engaged in business practices that are wholly inappropriate for the context in which they're operating. I would refer folks to the U.S. Attorney for the state of Vermont, who recently settled a case regarding health management software with doctors' offices. This company provided free patient management software to doctors' offices and struck a secret deal with a pharmaceutical company, an opioid manufacturer, to provide doctors with prompts that would increase prescriptions to patients of opioids, highly addictive opioids. That is something that is driven, that of course required bad people to strike that deal, but technology enabled that prompt to show up on a computer screen during the doctor-patient interaction in a way that would be very difficult to replicate by hiring a bunch of drug marketers to hide in a closet in an exam room and burst out and say, but what about opioids? They're wonderful, right? So that really is being turbocharged by technology. The second example I would flag is folks can take out their mobile devices right now and download digital games that look like real casino games on which you can spend and lose real money. that are often either unregulated or underregulated. Certainly, games with shady odds or false promises designed to separate people from their wallets have existed for a long time. Normally, one would have to drive to a fair, to a casino, to another sort of establishment in order to engage in gaming, right? This is now in everybody's pocket, and I think that that helps turbocharge that interaction, particularly for folks who have gaming dependencies. And finally, the big picture challenge that I see out there, we have not talked a lot at this conference about the future of work and the way in which organizations and industries are capturing many of the benefits of increased productivity, and those that increased productivity is not typically accruing to workers. And I think that is increasingly a good thing for society, that productivity is going up, and all of us in the United States and around the world are getting our basic human needs met and then some. But the distribution of that income and what it means for the future of work and the future of a reasonably balanced and cohesive society is, I think, a challenge for all of us in the next decade.
That is a really good point, something I've not heard brought up enough, I think, in this conference. One of your earlier points, which I like, Professor Kaminsky mentioned this yesterday, this idea that values are always embedded in technology, and sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, and we're seeing this proliferation. I don't love this term, but this is the term of dark patterns, where you're deliberately designing technology to manipulate people, appeal to their frailties, and that's, the example you gave of the opioid addiction prompt, and this idea that I really appreciate. There used to be structural barriers that stood in between one's ability to manipulate people and appeal to their frailties, and now those barriers have gone down, and it's much easier to manipulate people. So that is a real problem, to appeal to their addictions or whatever issues. So those are some great points. Let me turn the question over to Chris. So I think part of our discussion has been that technology is just a reflection of the underlying conflicts among society and stakeholders, whether it's business and consumers, or government and citizens, or different societal groups, or different cultural. So I'll just throw this out to you.
Right.
What do you see as some of the biggest conflicts between societal stakeholders in this technological context?
Well, honestly, the biggest one I see is, we find it really easy, and maybe it's because we have a pessimism bent in this audience. I think we found that over the course of the last day. We find it really easy to highlight the concerns we have with technology, whether it's people and how they use it or how it's structured. I think the biggest conflict is a lack of accountability. And it was said yesterday that we are in kind of the awkward adolescence of online technology, and that's true. And the hallmark of becoming an adult is personal accountability, I think. And the ability to do that not only as an individual, but also as a part of society. And so I think we have a real choice in front of us about whether or not we are going to have a societal accountability for the technologies that we're using and the problems that we face, both structurally with technology and with the power that comes with everyone having access to it. There's, I think, an urgency and a demand from the public to deal with these problems that we can highlight and that everyone's pessimistic about. But at the same time, in my work in advocacy, I also see an opposed effort to outlast and avoid accountability from multiple industry players. And to really engage in this conversation. I mean, sure, folks will say nice things about, please regulate me, but when you come up with ideas about regulating them, they're not so happy with your solutions. And then they wait for you to come up with more that they can try and shoot down. We're going to have to decide whether or not, average citizens who don't feel empowered to protect themselves individually, if we are going to, as a society, make rules that that protect society as a whole. And it's challenging because it runs up against other values like free expression. And I think we're going to struggle with it. But these concerns and these harms and these things that society is asking for us to be accountable for are stacking up. And we're seeing old industries asked to get out from under regulations and protections that we agreed a long time ago were important for similar values. So I mean, Commissioner O'Reilly, I don't know if he's still here. He won't be surprised that I found his speech to reinforce that idea that somehow there's not a need for the Communications Act, and there's a decreasing need for the Federal Communications Commission when there are inherent values that it protects bothers me. And then to see the same in other burgeoning technology industries, I think is a concern. We're seeing a muddling of business models in policy conversations where folks who are providing one service are comparing themselves to folks who provide a totally different service and saying, please treat us the same when they have different harms. So the harms that come up with moderation of a social network are very different than the harms that come up with the moderation of a broadband service provider, which are different than the harms that come up with the moderation of a search engine, which are different than the harms that come up with the moderation of a big marketplace like Amazon. We have to start to wrestle with the different types of technology we have and not let these harms stack up over time. I think the biggest rub is that sense of urgency with the inertia of policymaking to actually deal with these problems as a society as a whole.
Great. And I just want to say, since this is a two-part panel, we're going to make sure the audience questions are in the second part when everyone has finished speaking rather than this part. So that's a really good point. You made a lot of interesting points about what I heard your biggest conflict was between those who use technology to cause harm and those who are harmed, and the lack of accountability between those two.
Right.
Let me throw this out to the rest of the panel. What are some other significant conflicts between stakeholders in this societal context? Yes.
So I mentioned this earlier. I think we're in the middle of a cultural war, a new phase in the cultural wars that have raged in this country for a long time, that is specifically focused on information technologies. I think when we look back at this period, we will see that is really what's been driving a lot of conflict here. And I'll frame this in terms that Chris used. He talked a lot about accountability, and I'm sure he has specific things in mind, specific pieces of legislation or regulations that he has in mind. But I think the concept itself is very much a double-edged sword. Do we want Google to be accountable for the decision that it made in our discussion yesterday to change the way that the search results were presented for the search for female CEO? Google decided that it was going to change that from the Barbie doll to pictures of female CEOs. Now, there are people in these culture wars who very much think that Google should be accountable to Congress, the Trump administration, to Republicans on the Federal Trade Commission, pressure from Fox News, whoever, for decisions that it makes that are social justice warrior decisions. I'm totally share Gabriella's concerns about this. And my point here is to illustrate that the concept of accountability is one that can be wielded by both sides in this debate. In fact, is being wielded by both sides. In fact, that's what this debate is really about. It's about certain people who are fighting to defend a reactionary view of society, one that I increasingly find repulsive, personally, that are framing these things as being about the censorship by big tech liberal media and them trying to impose their values on the rest of the country, right? Now, of course, it's also true that there are people on the left who have a somewhat similar approach to trying to work the refs to ensure that, just for example, that someone who doesn't respect what they think how someone should handle pronouns those people should be booted from a social media site like Twitter. And of course, these two sides feed off of each other because everything that companies do to move the ball forward in, if you will, a progressive direction is cited as an example by the Trumpist right of Silicon Valley overreach. So this is the dimension of social conflict that I am most focused on in my work. And I think it increasingly pervades everything that happens in Washington. So just for example.
So, let me just pause you right there because we're running low on time. I want to make sure So very quickly, anyone want to weigh in 30 seconds on societal? Yes.
I mean, you're absolutely right that the issues around how to adjudicate these problems are incredibly difficult, but maybe we can agree that when it comes to things like software for emissions testing in cars, aka the Volkswagen problem, or what results we get from a search engine, we should at least know why we get the results. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Or we should be able to audit software that has huge implications for voting and climate and environment, right? So I think that there's a way in which I agree that the adjudication of some of the thorny issues in terms of then how we configure things are really important, but we do need the baseline of accountability to know why we get the results we get from software.
Okay, this is a great point.
She's ready for panel two.
Gets to transparency and accessibility and comprehensibility of software, particularly artificial intelligence and the data and the values that are embedded. 30 seconds, anyone else before? All right, so I want to go, this is our next lead-in question. We've got 5 minutes and then we'll have a break and then we'll have another panel. The next panel is focused on solutions. So without getting into details, I want to know what would your ideal improved world look like in 10 years? So let me start with John, throw that out to you.
The benefits of our productivity gains will accrue much more broadly than they do today. We will have increasingly powerful tools in the hands of doctors, farmers, drivers, and individuals, and technology will be increasingly secure and safe.
Great. That was very concise. I love that. Anyone else? What was your ideal world look like in 10 years? And we'll figure out how to get there in the next panel. Yes.
I mean, everything you said,
Yeah.
And to have more both technologists who are serving the public interest, and let's just say public interest lawyers, policy makers, artists, who also are invested in technology to help realize that vision that John just
Great,
put
I
on
love
the table.
that. So bringing in the humanities and the social sciences and recognizing their importance.
That's right, and really a true marriage between the two.
Right, I love that. Liesl?
Sure. I loved Anne's vision yesterday that she painted for us at the end of the day of really thinking big about what we could do in the future if we could eliminate cars on the roads, if we could use technology to, in the same way that I mentioned earlier, give everyone back a little bit more of their time, make everyone's work a little bit more meaningful and satisfying by making sure that everyone is part of that conversation and bringing a whole diversity of views into the conversation about design and deployment. Yeah, that would be mine.
Chris, you look like you have something to say.
No, I'm agreeing with everyone else. I guess the only thing I would add is, as I mentioned before, that these sorts of technologies are available and accessible to everyone, that the benefits that we all value here can really be utilized by anyone and everyone.
Great. And Baron?
Carl Schroeder yesterday said something about how the thing that really matters is the ability to solve problems, and that in turn rests on our ability to know what truth is. I think my ideal vision is that this epistemic crisis that we're in has technological solutions, that there are better ways of intermediating between users and to help them recognize what is good journalism and bad journalism, and to make better choices. I think that's the only dimension of improvement that really matters.
That's great. So what I've heard is in 10 years, we want a world in which we can figure out the truth, where the gains in productivity are distributed more evenly, that technology is helping making our life better, and that we appreciate the humanities and the social sciences and bring them in as part of the solution and don't emphasize technology as the only solution. I think we do have time for one quick question from the audience. do I see a hand? All right, well, if there's no questions, this is going to be a two-part panel. So you've had a 10-minute
guy
break,
right there.
and we'll come back with
Wait, you have a-
Forstelia
you have a-
in 10
you have a
minutes
question.
for a second. So
Couldn't tell if
please
he was
give me a
kidding or not.
warm welcome for this great panel.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheridan. And as he said, please be back in the room at 10:40, and we will pick back up.